I've been asked to choose two subjects to give you special lectures on law on, and in the first one I want to talk about the hybrid case of Japan. How many of you have ever been to Japan? One. How many of you have read any books or articles about Japan? A few. Okay, so there's some background. Talking about Japan, I've chosen Japan as a hybrid case. These lectures really should come after my introductory lectures on the history of law, which will come in the second half of the term, because they are dissolving categories which I talk about in more detail there. So they'll perhaps make more sense when I've finished all four lectures. But in this lecture I want to introduce you to something that has puzzled me and still puzzles many people in the world, which is the enigmatic and odd situation in relation to law and crime in Japan. Now this is an important issue. You have 120 million people with the second biggest economy on earth, and it's something that a lot of people are devoting attention to. At the moment there's a big American delegation who have been in touch with me trying to help the Japanese introduce jury service into Japan. They don't have juries in Japanese trials. The Japanese say they want to have juries. They did try in the 1920s, 30s to have juries and then abolished them because they didn't work. They're trying to introduce them again, and I personally think it's a complete disaster and unlikely to be achievable for some of the reasons I'll explain. But also the way in which they're setting up the juries means that they aren't juries in the Western sense at all. What the Japanese have done, as always, is to alter or modify the concept of a jury. Instead of 12 independent human beings who take the judgment on whether the person is guilty or innocent, which is a central feature of the jury system, what they've got is the judge sitting with some lay people alongside the judge. And as everyone has pointed out, and they jointly come to a decision. This means that they're not independent of the judge, which is the principal aim of the jury system, and also they are bound to be very heavily influenced by a professional judge, given the nature of Japanese society in particular. So I just mentioned this as an example of what I'm going to be talking about, which is the way in which Western legal concepts and ideas have been involuted and convoluted and changed in the Japanese context. If the general framework of Japan interests you, and I may be self-promoting, since I last gave this lecture a year ago, my book on Japan, called Japan and Looking Through the Looking Glass, has come out, which is an overview of the whole of Japanese culture, economy, politics, history, and so on. And there are a few pages which digest to a certain extent of this lecture, so if you want to have it in another form, you can find it there, or on my website, which is under my name, where you can download a PDF which gives you a long article on Japanese law and custom. Now the first puzzle I want to address is the absence of crime in Japan. It's almost an axiom, I think, that when societies become modern, in the sense of being industrial, individualistic, capitalistic, urban, crime rates rise. This has been widely observed. And one might have thought this is always going to be the case. Atomistic individualism and so on will lead to rising crime rates. Japan is a total exception to this. Not only are the crime rates very, very low, and I'll explain what I mean, but also they've been dropping. The crime rates now are lower than they were, say, 100 years ago, by all measures. And year by year they dropped. They went up a bit in the economic recession, but they've gone down again. So Japan does exactly the opposite of every other industrial society I know of. The figures I'll give you, which are on the article on my website and in the book, are fairly old, but they still hold true. That is that if you take the cases of murder, this is in the 1970s, 80s, and compare the murder rates in Japan and in the United States. For every 10 murders in the United States, there's approximately one or maybe a little over one. So the rates are about 10 times higher, murder rates. Rape rates are about 15 times higher in the States. Robbery is 200 times. The robbery rates in the States are 200 times, 218 to 2.1 per thousand. Theft, about 6 or 7 times higher. So basically you have reported crime rates which are, say, a 10th, 20th, 30th of those in the United States, and much, much lower than those in industrialized countries in Europe as well. Now you might say, oh well, that's an illusion. There's a famous problem with crime rates, which is that they reflect underreporting, and the only way to get around this is to do what are known as victimization surveys, which again could be distorted but are much safer, which is that you go and ask a selected sample of people whether they have had a robbery, a theft, and so on. Murder is a bit more difficult to cover up, and of course rape may be not the sort of thing you can do a victimization survey about very easily, but theft and robbery you can, particularly theft, which is less serious. And they've done a number of these in Japan, and they've looked at especially minor cases which are often not reported to the police, and they've shown that this isn't a statistical illusion, that the actual rates as people perceive them and report them when they're asked about what has actually happened are also very low. Now rates give you one figure, and another kind of approach is to look at the qualitative evidence. And throughout the 20th century, the qualitative evidence was that Japan was an extremely safe society in terms of any kind of violent crime. In the recent reported remarks of our Home Secretary that she wouldn't walk alone home at night in parts of London late at night bears no relation to what was reported through the 20th century in Japan. One of the greatest ever lawyers, an American called Wigmore, W-I-G-M-O-R-E, who wrote many volumes on the laws of Japan, visited it many times. In the 1930s, he found a general peacefulness and happiness of society in Japan, noting that one can see in New York in one night such exhibitions of violence, brawling and abandoned lawlessness as one would not see in an entire year in Tokyo. One of the books referred to by Bailey, who was an expert in Japanese crime, echoes the feeling that as American and European visitors quickly learn in Japan, cities are habitable places where one may move about freely at all times of the day and night without feeling anxious and taking extraordinary precautions. When I went to Japan for the first time in 1990, I was given a booklet by the British Council with advice on how to live in Japan. It says, the Japanese have good manners and are courteous and helpful to strangers. They're not usually good at spoken English. They do not like peremptory orders or raised voices. They're extremely honest. Any suggestion they are not gives great offence. Japanese cities, including Tokyo, are entirely safe to walk out alone at all hours of the day and night. Now, the British Council knew full well that if one person was assaulted after having got this kind of advice, they would be sued. But that's the advice they gave. There is crime, but the chances of a visitor being involved in any way are extremely slim. And I found this, my first shock in arriving in a northern Japanese city was to go to the supermarket with my hosts, and as we were leaving the car in a big municipal car park, I said to them, oh, you've forgotten to lock your door and you've forgotten to shut the windows of your car. And they said, no, you don't have to do that here. And the house I lived in 1997 in Japan, right in central Tokyo, had no protection at all. I mean, it was just paper, shoji, front door. You can put your hand through it and just take the very, very elementary wooden lock away. So, and I've walked through many parts of Japan late at night, and it feels very safe. For example, in Tokyo, a little time ago, we're told that guns are reported as being present in less than 20 crimes a year in Tokyo. And Tokyo was the biggest city in the world. Over 20 million people and 20 guns in a year. It's not much. The only people who were allowed a license to have them were the Olympics shooting team. And hard drug problems are very limited and have declined as a problem in Japan. So why? You could think of various reasons to explain this, and I don't really know, but I'll give you some of my guesses. You could think it's because of the harshness of the punishments. So a Home Secretary in this country would immediately say, oh, well, it's the punishments, you know, we need to raise more and more severe punishments to keep down crime rates. In fact, Japan's punishments are extremely light. The Japanese hate sending anyone to prison. They have an extensive use of suspended prosecution by public prosecutors, fines and suspended sentences by criminal courts, and dismissal and probation by family courts. Very few people are sent to prison. They are dealt with in the community. For instance, we're told that less than 2% of all those convicted of a crime ever serve a jail sentence in Japan, as well as compared with 45% in the United States. 2% against 45%. Something like I think it's something like 1 in 100 people in America is locked up. I've got a statistic with the right number of noughts on it. Mostly black, mostly poor. In Japan, there are very, very few people in prison because of this. And when they do go, they go for a very, very short time usually. Almost half the prison sentences in Japan have been for 1 year or less, while in America only 4% of such a short period as a year. Now, that isn't to say that Japanese prisons are wonderful. They're pretty awful. If you do get sent to a Japanese prison and you get sent there for a serious offence, then they're a nightmare, I'm told. When I told my Japanese friends with whom I wrote this book that in English prisons there's sometimes re-education, that people sometimes have television sets in their rooms or in communal facilities and so on, they were absolutely amazed. They said no long-term Japanese institution. A person who is sent to prison for a very long period in Japan is considered a total outcast, irredeemable, set to hard labour often, more or less mentally insane. So, but I don't think this is a deterrent, as I mentioned, because this is a very, very unusual outcome. Now, you might think there was another reason for this low crime rate, and that is the inefficiency of the Japanese police or prosecution system, which is related to this reporting problem. But in fact, the Japanese police, once they get notified of a crime, and the courts have much better rates than most other countries. For instance, a fairly recent survey suggested the Japanese police solved 57% of reported cases as compared to the 20% of the American police. And the clearance rate for violence crimes against a person is 92% in Japan as compared to 43% in the US. What is even more extraordinary, but this is explained by something else, is that the conviction rate in Japan is 99% of all those that go to trial. Now this is because, as I'll explain to you, they sift out. They won't accuse or take a case against someone to trial unless it's 99% sure that they've got the evidence and they can convict them. And it may also have, as some have alleged, to do with fairly heavy-handed methods tantamount to minor torture, which is used by some Japanese police to extract confessions. There are allegations of this, I haven't followed it up. I think the explanation, though, is somewhere else. It's to do with the nature of Japanese society and morality and ethics, and that's why, really, to understand it, you have to widen the whole thing out. One obvious thing that's often been pointed out is that people don't offend because of interpersonal pressures and responsibilities. This was noticed a long time ago by Montesquieu when he, in his Spirit of the Laws, noticed that the Japanese had a group responsibility towards individual behaviour. He wrote of the laws which punish a family or a whole ward for a single crime, which makes every man the inspector, witness and judge of his neighbour's conduct. That's in the spirit of the laws. And many observers, from David Reisman, the sociologist, and others who visited Japan, have said the same thing. The traditional legal entities, that is the house or lineage or whatever you call it, it's peculiar and special, called the ie, i.e. An artificial kinship group, or the village, the mura, were responsible. And if one person in a family or a household was convicted of theft or whatever the offence was, the whole village or the whole family would be punished, as was the case in medieval law in this country to a certain extent. You might think this is all faded away, but it actually has maintained itself in a rather diminished form. It's not whole villages or wide artificial kin groups, but certainly smaller groups still feel the shame, more than the punishment, physical punishment, if one of their members transgresses in some way. Any of you who spend time in Japan, if you watch Japanese trials, or when I've been to one or two Japanese law courts and watched trials, the whole family is there, and if during the proceedings they very often burst into tears and break down and weep and say, you know, our whole family is disgraced and so on. And when you have one or two of these very famous cases of a murder or a child killing another child or something, the television is filled for a long time of weeping parents and relatives saying, you know, it's our fault, we brought this person up in a lousy way, we're to blame, and so on. There's a certain sense of responsibility. I just found this in another way, which is when I was with my colleague and friends I wrote this book with. He's a professor of law at the Hokkaido University, and on one occasion I was to meet him for lunch and he rang me up and said, Alan, I'm afraid I can't go. One of my students has been found shoplifting and I have to go to court and bail her out, or him out, because a professor is responsible for their students. Now, if any of you shoplift, in a large number of years in this department, I've had to bail my own daughter out on one occasion for such activities. Perhaps I shouldn't mention this. She's grown up now, she won't mind maybe. But I've never had to bail out a student. We are in loco parentis, in a sense, in the position of a parent to you, but I don't think that extends to criminal liability. And that's just an example of the wider group being responsible. So this widens out into something which is a famous metaphor, or rather cliche almost, of Japan. That is that it's a managed society. In Japanese that is kandi, K-A-N-D-I, hyphen shakai, S-H-A-K-A-I. A society where everyone is managing everyone else. A huge amount of self-policing, mutual surveillance. It's easy to make this into a stereotype and oversimplify this, and the full account is in the book. Basically, it's a society where you are reflected in the other. It's a structural society where everyone's behaviour affects you and your behaviour affects everyone else. Not an individualistic society in the Western sense. This can lead to famous Japanese sayings like the protruding nail is hammered down. If you deviate in any way, put yourself up above others, you're hammered down. And this applies to a baby, a child, a growing up teenager, and an adult. And this stops people deviating, and particularly normally committing serious crimes. Another factor which is related to this is a very sophisticated system of tracking people. Throughout Japanese history, people had to register their birth and so on at a local temple. And for some hundreds of years they were given a kind of identity card. They're called soseki. Koseki, K-O-S-E-K-I. And this is still in place. I've met people and I've asked them what they're doing. They're saying, well, I'm registering with the town hall because I've moved from Kyoto to Tokyo, and I had to register with the police and town hall here. It may not be entirely necessary now, but it's more or less necessary. Everyone has their identity card when they move. This meant that traditionally it was very easy to trace people when they moved and to catch criminals of various kinds. Finally, there's one factor which really surprised me and I hadn't thought of, and this is the organisation of criminal organisations in Japan. Usually at this point in the lecture I ask if any of you are members of the Yakuza. You could say yes, but I could have told that you aren't by looking at all your hands. None of you have missing fingers? No? Okay, so you're probably not Yakuza. You had to chop off, if you offended your senior, you had to chop off your finger and present it to them as an act of contrition. So many Yakuza have these, and of course I could examine your backs and see if you had tattoos on your backs. That would be another sign. Now you may wonder, how could a criminal organisation be important in reducing crime rates in Japan? And the reason why this may be the case is the Yakuza. How many of you have heard of the Yakuza? Okay, but most of you have, but you probably don't know much about it. One of the big problems of all governments in industrial and other societies is that much behaviour is on a borderline. It's in a kind of Mary Douglas ambiguous, dangerous zone. Not quite illegal, it's not quite legal. Drink, certain sports and activities, gambling, prostitution, soft drugs. All these are sort of greyish area. Some people think, cannabis is this and something that, prostitution. It's very difficult to police these areas. There's a lot of money swirling around. And if you use the normal police force to police this area, they're confused about the status of this. And also, they are very likely to get corrupted themselves. They come into contact with this corrupt world, and very large numbers of them become part of that world. The Yakuza, which is a guild, a za is a guild of people. You can have guilds of actors and guilds of this and that. Is a very old organisation in Japan, 400, 500, 600 years old. Yakuza are three numbers, 893, and it's a particularly dangerous and unpleasant combination in a traditional three-dice game in Japan. And that gives you the clue that it was mainly a guild to control gambling to a certain extent, drink, and then it spread out into prostitution and other entertainments. The Yakuza have always been semi-legal. We think of them like the mafia or the triads or other completely illegal organizations, but the Yakuza aren't like that. They are a public body. For instance, my first shock encounter with the Yakuza was when I was walking through a street in a city in Japan, and I went to film with this camera what I took to be a late night taxi stall. Lights were on and there was a counter and people standing there, and I thought this is interesting, I'll go and film it. And my friends just tapped me on the shoulder and said, Alan, I don't think you ought to go and film that properly. That is a Yakuza recruiting office on the main street. You go in and you join the Yakuza. Well, you won't find many mafia recruiting offices or triad recruiting offices. Or to give you another nice anecdote, the Yakuza have their annual meetings. It's not secret like Friends of the Italian Opera in Some Like It Hot. It's open, and they all turn up with various Yakuza organizations for their annual meeting. They go to a big hotel in one of the Japanese cities, turn up in their stretch limousines, dark glasses, smart, sharp suits. On one occasion they did this, and all their cars were given parking tickets by the local police because they had arrange the parking. So next year they arranged the parking and the police gave them a proper car park, put their stretch limousines in. They demonstrate, if there's an unpleasant act of Parliament or someone says unpleasant things about it, they go out on the streets with notices saying, be kind to the Yakuza, we're not as bad as you think. So there they are, and every Japanese police post, and there are lots of them all dotted around, has a computer printout of all the members of the local Yakuza. So when something goes wrong, when someone commits a crime or whatever, they will ring up their friends in the Yakuza, and they have special training in the police force to do this, and say, have you got any ideas? And the Yakuza, a bit like the Mafia, will put out the word, you shouldn't have done that, return this thing. The Yakuza don't like what you're doing, or they'll pass on information to the police. And the police are able to solve the problem. They are not allowed to have guns. I remember once when I was there, a Yakuza being discovered with a gun and 3 bullets in his hotel bedroom, and there was a huge row. They are meant to be against hard drugs. They keep out the triads. My friends point out that I shouldn't be too nice about them, but they're pretty thuggish and pretty tough, and they beat people up and threaten them. It's a protection agency, really. But on the other hand, they also act as a kind of firewall to protect the police and make crime detection more efficient. At that point, I'll just break for 2 minutes, as I characteristically do, as you know in my lectures. If there's any very small point that you would like to ask me about, any name or thing I've said, then do. Otherwise, just relax for 2 minutes, because you can't concentrate for more than about 40 minutes, at least, if you're like me. Anyone mess with Yakuza? No? So, go out, come in again.
Quick question. I'd read in the news recently
Yes.
where they were, or in the British press, where they had said that Bob the Builder, the
Yes.
children's show, is being exported to Japan, but they were concerned because apparently Bob the Builder only has 4 fingers, and they were afraid that not having 5 fingers would scare Japanese children. Is there any merit to that?
Well, yes, indeed. I mean, if he had 4 fingers just like that, I mean, what would really scare them, obviously, is if he had a stump, for the 5th finger. But I think it might be frightening, yes, because people know that this is a signal of a criminal organisation. The fact that they have physical marks on their body, which any policeman watching them pass through customs and so on, like missing finger or like the famous tattoos on their backs, suggests it's not very secret. I mean, the cutting off of a finger is not I think most Yakuza now don't do that. If you're interested in the Yakuza and interested in them, there's a wonderful book called something like Memoirs of a Yakuza. It was written, if you look on that, you'll probably find it if you can't, let me know. It was written from tape recordings, oral history account by a Japanese doctor in the early part of the 20th century. He wrote 2 books, both wonderful. One was Memories of Silk and Straw, and the other was Memoirs of a Yakuza. And it was a dying Yakuza in his practice, who he tape recorded his life. And it gives a very graphic and interesting, moving picture of the underworld of Japan up to about the time of the Great Fire and so on in the 1920s. Okay. Yes.
If their origins were controlling gambling and that, was that...
Sorry?
If their origins were in controlling gambling and other things, was it of any form of authority at that point, or just...
Do you mean a general Japanese authority or within the organisation?
Were they an organisation previous to that? I mean, it just seems strange if they're in some ways a parallel organisation to the police. Just interested in how they came about or something.
I'm not sure, because I'm deaf, whether I entirely heard you correct. Their origins were really in sports, games, leisure. They also controlled wandering actors, prostitution, the water trades, as they're sometimes called, and there was obviously the Japanese state, but there wasn't any other guild that I know of that preceded them. They're a medieval guild. Their dating is different, and they've just gradually evolved to widen their... They do a lot with... They organise things like circuses. They organise all the sumo wrestling in Japan. So big money. No doubt they've got legitimate outlets. There are other forms of them. They're not true yakuza, for instance, who sell their services to big Japanese companies. And they sit along the back in shareholders' meetings with their dark glasses and their sharp suits. And if some shareholder gets up and starts complaining, they start shifting around in their seats at the back. The question goes away. And in return, they're given large holiday homes on nice beaches in Japan by this company. This is sort of semi-elite, but they have many legitimate firms as well. They own lots of travel agencies and hotels and, you know, normal things. They launder their money very effectively. Even the income tax inspectors go and inspect their books sometimes. So it's just on the... Anyway, on to litigation. The last point perhaps I could have made there is that the embedded, interrelated nature of law keeping in the Japanese, or crime avoidance in the Japanese society reminds me very much of what I found when I worked in an entirely, apparently different society, a tribal upland peasant community in the Himalayas in Nepal, where there was very little. I mean, they could only remember one murder in living memory in this group, and very little theft or any serious crimes. And the thing that struck me about it was that the effects of being known to be a criminal in that organisation would mean that you would cut off all your social ties, your family would be dishonoured, you would probably have to leave the village and so on. You wouldn't necessarily be punished by the police. So the constraints were largely social rather than policing. And Japan reminds me of a large, very large interrelated village in that sense. Now turning to litigation. Here, again, the rates of litigation, that is civil litigation, people suing each other in civil courts about contracts and debts and things like this, are very low. This has been the case in Japan, again, for some centuries. Japanese were advised in all the manuals and by their rulers that they shouldn't bring actions in court against each other. Completely opposite of English law, where the Crown makes money out of prosecutions, and therefore people were encouraged to litigate as much as possible in this country through history. And in America there are lots of profits to be made, but the Japanese rulers and heads of houses and so on try to dissuade all kind of legal actions. For example, in 1445 there's a proclamation that all quarrels and disputes are strictly forbidden. If this is disobeyed, both sides will be put to death without inquiry into right and wrong. It's like a parent saying, I don't want to hear, you know, you're fighting, you two, just shut up. I don't want to hear either side's story, just shut up, don't fight. The founder of the Hamaguchi house left the injunction, endure patiently and wait your turn, do not go to law. In the constitution of the Horyuchi brewing family, we must never forget the saying, the peasant should never run out of rapeseed and never go to law, and so on. You should keep distant the hell of accusation. And this has continued. By American standards, the rates of litigation are petty, according to Tanabe and Von Muren's book on Japanese law, which is on the reading list. The number of civil suits per capita in Japanese courts is between 1/10 and 1/20 of the number in common law countries like America and Britain. In the Kodansha dictionary, if you want to learn about Japan, there's a wonderful encyclopedia or dictionary called the Kodansha. I think it's on the reading list. And if you're interested in Japanese ceramics or aesthetics or politics or law, there are very, very good articles. It's in the university library. And in the article on judicial process, it says that 1/10 or 1/20 the number in common law countries. And the rates of litigation have been dropping. According to Haley, litigation has been less frequent in absolute numbers in the post-war years than the period from 1890 to the outbreak of the China-Japanese War. An index of this is the scarcity of lawyers and judges in Japan, which are about 1 in 10 of the numbers in the United States. And almost all of them are in Tokyo and Osaka. Or again, if you compare it with Germany, we find that with less than 2/3 of Japan's population, Germany has nearly 6 times as many judges as Japan. There are fewer lawyers and judges per capita now than there were in the mid-1920s. How are we to explain this? Well, I'll be going into this a little more in my other lectures, but basically if you compare two systems of justice, there are those which in the West we take as normal. You should know all this anyway. That is to say, legal process is a confrontational, oppositional activity, rather like a competitive game. It's just like tennis, really, except other issues are at stake. It's a binary system where the role of justice is to make absolute decisions that one side has won and the other side has lost, between individuals in civil litigation or between the individual and the state in criminal litigation. Here the court is a mechanism for allocating guilt and responsibility in a fairly black and white way. People are thought to obey the laws mainly because of the power of the state or the power of the law to stop them offending. This is the essence of the Anglo-American judicial system, oversimplified of course. The other extreme, which I'll talk about in more depth, is characterized by the famous book by Bohannon, Bohannon, on the TIV. They take the view that the point of law and justice is reconciliation. Judicial process is an attempt to heal wounds as a way to reintegrate people who are in long-term relations with each other, smoothing out the temporary difficulties which have occurred in that relationship and returning them to the normal equilibrium. Law is not a competitive game, but a harmonizing ritual of incorporation. The aim is to stop people breaking off, to stop saying this person is right, that person is wrong. It's to try and adjust statuses and to bring people into harmony. And in this situation, it's also based on the premise of unequal statuses. Everything is relative to your status, so that what is right for one person in this system, what is right for an uncle to do, is not necessarily right for a nephew to do. What is right for a woman to do is not necessarily the same as what is right for a man to do, and so on. Now, if you take that gross, very simple, oversimplified contrast, where does Japan stand? You won't be surprised to find that it falls decidedly on the side of the TIV, of Bohannon, on the side of the tribal, non-modern, reconciling, reintegrating status and context-dependent situation. Traditionally, individuals did not have rights. There was no concept of individual right. There was no word in Japanese for the word human right. It had to be invented in the late 19th century. A compound word invented then was kenri, K-E-N-R-I, the two parts of it meaning power or influence, and ri meaning interest, power or influence of your interest. And that is the closest the Japanese have to individual rights, but they still don't really think of people as having individual rights. You have group rights. The group comes before the individual. You know this from your anthropology. This is the normal situation of human beings. The individual is more important. The group is more important than the individual. And in this situation, disputes between people take a entirely different course. The emphasis in such a situation is on conciliation or mediation at the local level. Historically, we're told that mediation is the manner in which Japanese farmers have settled their disputes for centuries. As a monograph on Japanese farming families by Beardsley put it, mediation is the god of the times. Almost all cases are settled out of court. As Henderson, whose article is on reading this, puts it, most private disputes on the village level were settled by didactic or coerced conciliation. An insistence upon a clear-cut, all-or-nothing decision in favour of one disputant rather than a compromise settlement in which each disputant conceded something was regarded as inimical to group harmony. And one of the best books on Japan by the American anthropologist Robert Smith says, if there's one word that subsumes much of what there is of Tokugawa law, that's the great period of about 250 years from the early part of the 17th century to the middle of the 19th century, it is conciliation. There are three kinds of conciliation. In the Tokugawa villages, there was informal conciliation, or jidan, J-I-D-A-N. The second kind is called thotai, T-H-O-T-E-I, which is a form of pre-litigation procedure, which is built into Japanese law. You have to try and reconcile before you even get to litigation, and try this method. And this was devised piecemeal in Japan in the years between the two world wars. And the third is wakai, W-A-K-A-I, is a direct German borrowing, a procedure by which the judge encourages and assists the disputants to reach a compromise settlement. When you take your civil case to a judge, the first thing the judge will do is say, can't you settle it among yourselves? And they say, no, we can't. And you'll say, well, I'll try and help you. You know, you can come and I'll sit there and you can talk to each other and I'll give you green tea periodically and so on. In other words, encourage you to not bring it to court. Now, why is this? Well, this takes you out into, again, the whole of Japanese society. Part of it is the emphasis in Japanese culture on harmony rather than assertiveness. As again Henderson writes in relation to law, we might characterize the American attitude as, I'm right and he's wrong. I'll take him to court and the court will tell him so. The Japanese attitude, and Henderson's an American writer, I think, the Japanese attitude, on the other hand, seems to place more emphasis on group harmony than upon the vindication of individual rights. I'm right and he's wrong, but for the sake of group harmony, it's better to compromise than go to court. Now, a graphic example of this is to be found in the autobiographical account of working in Japan by a man called Brian Merrim, who's one of the leading anthropologists of Japan. He was at the School of Oriental and African Studies, N-O-E-R-A-N. I think it's called a Kubo Diary. And in that he describes how, when he was living in Japan, his son, I think it was a small boy, dived into his school swimming pool, and they hadn't put enough water in, and he cracked his head and was seriously ill and had to have various operations. Brian was married to a Japanese wife. He lived in Japan for many years, and he was an anthropologist. But he said, this isn't good enough. We must stop this. Other people are going to do the same thing. So he brought a case against the school. And what he found was that all his friends, all his teacher friends, everyone else said, you mustn't do this. You know, we'll reform it, but you mustn't bring litigation against the school in which you work. Gradually, they all faded away. And he was left entirely alone, and he left Japan. I don't know what happened to his marriage, because he insisted on individual rights and on shaming and naming and the Western idea that you bring people to court for dereliction of this kind. And it was right against, people just said, this is against our culture, you mustn't do it. Everything is very carefully wrapped up in Japanese society. Elaborate precautions are taken to stop any kind of dispute taking place to begin with. A very nice example of this is something called nemawashi, N-E-M-A-W-A-S-H-I. This is the Japanese word for root binding. If you go into a Japanese city, you'll quite often see someone pulling along a wheelbarrow of some kind, or a small lorry carrying large, very large trees, fully grown trees more or less, and moving them from one place to another. And the reason they're able to do that is that for the last 3 years these trees have been root bound. If any of you are gardeners, you may know about this process. You basically cut off the roots but leave the tree in the ground, and then it puts up a dense mass closer in, and you bind up the roots, and finally after 2 or 3 years you can very easily move this tree to another place, which you couldn't do if you just dug it up. Nemowashi is a procedure in all Japanese organizations and so on. If you're going to restructure a Japanese firm, you don't just one day announce to your employees that they're being moved from one place to another. You carefully root bind over a long period, tell them what's going to change so that they don't suffer this shock. And that's just one of the many procedures that are done to diminish shock. The main point really is that law, like the economy and like politics and like religion, as you'll see if you look at my book, is embedded. The famous Polanyi metaphor of embedding and disembedding. Disembedding of the economy hasn't occurred in Japan. Japan has an embedded economy. It has an embedded political system, and it has an embedded religious system. As one of the most wonderful books by Milton Singer, actually it's not Milton Singer, but it's Singer, writes, law has not yet emerged from the stream of common life as a sphere of its own, imposed the fluidity and many-sidedness of life in an abstract form, rational, hard, and lucid. Between law and custom, habit and convention, order of nature and order of reason, natural inclination and social duty, no rigid demarcation lines are drawn. Everything remains contingent on circumstances, subject to swift transition. So nothing is separated off. And as a result, the Japanese legal system is diametrically opposed to that of Anglo-European law. The surface looks like Anglo-European law because they've brought in many of the terms, and even the law buildings have a Western surface. When you go inside, the ethic, the ideology is totally different. You can see this in one other example. They were told that they needed lawyers. So they have very big law schools which train thousands of lawyers every year. But they don't need them. So what do? Well, the result is that they fail 90% of those who take law courses. So that they can't practice. Extraordinary idea. You go into law school knowing that there's only 1 in 10 chance of passing. You go into it because it doesn't matter. If you've been to particularly Tokyo Law School, which is the training ground for all the top administrators and civil servants and politicians, or any other good law school, you get a job, but you won't get a job as a lawyer because it's not needed. So you have a system where the Japanese run one of the most sophisticated industrial market economies in the world, with an astonishingly low level of lawsuits. Is odd because we tend to think that that's one of the oiling mechanisms or necessary mechanisms for maintaining an advanced economy. Lots of lawyers and lots of litigation. There are costs to this. Brian Merrin found one of the costs. Another cost is that you have to bow with the system, bend with the system. If, for instance, you're stopped by a Japanese policeman for a minor offence, like jaywalking, crossing the street without in the wrong place, or a minor traffic offence or something like that, there's absolutely no point saying you didn't do it, or it wasn't entirely your fault, it was someone else's fault. You just say, I'm very sorry, I won't do it again. You confess, you don't argue, and you'll probably be released with caution. If you start arguing about it and saying, then the policeman will take you off and you'll be charged. Just like, again, as I mentioned, like a parent with a child. If the child has done something, you think they've done something, you say, you've done something. If they just say, I'm sorry, it's cleared away straight away. If they start arguing about it, you get a confrontation. So again, the final outcome is that, to my surprise, going from the Himalayas in Nepal to Japan meant that I left what I thought was a shamanic tribal world, a holistic, integrated Gemeinschaft, as they would put it, tribal world where harmonious social relations are more important than abstract rights or divisive allocation of precise blame. But in fact, my quite long visits to Japan and working with Japanese colleagues and scholars led me to realize that, in fact, I moved from one shamanic tribal society to another. Why that is the case, that you have one industrial civilization on Earth which is totally different in almost every respect from all other civilizations on this Earth, even from China, is the mystery which is behind the book, and that's the final plug. But it's one manifestation of it is this very odd difference in their criminal and civil litigation. Thank you very much, and next time I'll be talking about the Inquisition and terrorism.